So at this point, I have my deck drawing information already completed. I have my pergola information already completed. But what I haven't really indicated to the builder yet is how am I going to create this fixed planter? Well, they need to understand exactly what this fixed planter is, how it relates to the deck, as well as how we're going to construct it. I'm going to move to model space where I have more detailed information. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the pergola, which firstly, I'm going to copy a lot of this information over. So I'm just going to pick a section that looks like that. And I will this time move this down below and change this so that it is straight down. And in here, I'm going to modify some of the data because it's not necessary. I don't need a lot of this stuff in here. Don't need a lot of this stuff in here. And from here, I have all the framing. Now, once again here, I have this at a sort of a skewed angle. And I'm going to work on the details on how this looks so that the builder can actually build this opening. And in order to do so, I find it easier, once again, I'm going to rotate this at a 45-degree angle so that I have a straight on view for the opening. It's not absolutely necessary. I could work in this direction as well. I just find it simpler to work with in the direction where it can be easily laid out. So I will rotate all this and it will go counterclockwise 45 degrees. So I simply type in 45 and that's the view I want. Okay. So first thing I'm going to remove is the deck layer. So I don't see that. There's my drawing, and it gives me some critical information on how this is being built. But the majority of the information that I really need is how this frame is. I'm going to include the two beams just as a reference, but it's not really necessary in this particular case. So I will copy that and that beam and this beam. I don't need that, so we'll type in R and enter and remove that. I think I have everything I need. Looks like it. If I don't, I can always refer to that drawing. And I'll move that down here. And now I want to draw a section through here so that the builder can see what it is I'm creating. I'm going to remove some of this other redundant information I don't quite need. But that is the critical information. So how am I creating that? Okay, that's my plan view. I'm going to make my sectional view through this by copying this further down. It looks like I'm copying it a lot of times, but there's a reason why. These are all 2x6s. So I'm going to go into this layer where I have my deck finish layer. I can make a new one, or I can just use that. And I'm going to draw a horizontal line. And I will offset that 1.5 inches. That's the thickness of the wood. And now I can do all my trimming. I just pick everything. Get rid of that. Get rid of this. That. We didn't trim it to those edges. Okay, so let's try it again. Trim. That's better. That's what I wanted the first time. Not sure why it didn't do that. A little bit of a glitch. Okay. And there are my two beams. Now, how far away from the ground are they and all that? I have that information already. I have that information here. So I could take a look at this and see what I can sort of scavenge from here. And I'm going to take this information right here. This looks good. I'm going to copy all this right here, including grade, including that beam. I don't need that pole, but I do need that. I don't need, so I'll type in R and enter, this here. And yeah, that looks pretty good. So take all that for this drawing I have going on down here. And let's move that here. I don't see it. Oh, I probably have my F8 on, so take my F8 off. There it is. Now it's come back to me. So there's my beam. Now I'm going to move it in place. So move this from where? Well, anywhere along this red line and hit anywhere along this, it's like perpendicular, that line. So that's where my beam is. Here's my item where I have my opening, and here are some joists. I'm leaving that just for references so I can copy and paste and move it around later on. And now I'm ready to create my second beam. Zoom in on all this. That's the only information I really need. I'm going to copy the line work as well. And this time I'm going to go from this center point. I'm picking nearest, but this is a center line. And I want to go perpendicular only because I want them at the same height. I want all this information at the same height. That refers to the two beams that are supporting this opening. Now I'm ready to work on my planter. So the planter, I've decided to make it about 3-foot height. It's going to be 2x6 framing that we're going to be using, and then the deck will be applied to that. I will actually move what I just created down below to this location. So the first thing I'm going to do is create my framing. So that's at 5.5, comma. It's 3 feet tall. I got about 1.5 inches above it, but I'll leave it at 36. That's fine. And then I'll decide what kind of siding I'm going to apply to this, because it's basically just an open frame. And I could use other 2x6s to frame this out, or I could use cedar planks or anything like that. It really doesn't matter. So why don't I just use the 2x6 that I already have up in here. Now these are separate lines. I want to make a single unit, so it's just easier to copy and paste. So I will draw a rectangle to that shape, move what I just drew to there, and rotated it. Now I haven't decided exactly where it's going to go. I will make sure I rotate that at a 90-degree angle. And then this will be the siding I'm going to apply to that. Now, it's not overly creative here. I can make any kind of siding I want. It really doesn't matter at this point. So I will copy this along this. Now, none of this is structural in the sense of it's supporting the deck. But what it's doing is providing some sort of support to make sure that the soil that I have in here doesn't go outwards. So I've got to decide where I want this relative to that position. I want to have a 1-inch lip, so I'm going to select 1. I'm going to offset the existing information inwards and then move my planter framing to that location. Remove my reference line, and this will be the outside of my planter, and this will sit on the actual deck. Now, how does the bottom of that look? Well, this decking material or information I have down here now will play a role. So I will move all of this. I'm going to move it from the underside surface of the deck. So the decking is 5/4 inch, so I'm going to the underside of it. And I'm going to go and move that. And I want that underside of that information to line up with that first board. I could place it on top. It's all sort of decisions you'll make based on aesthetics. As I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, you know what would be nicer is that if that first board were just to sit on top of that as opposed to the underneath it. Okay, I will first place it perpendicular to that, because this is where my beams are. I don't want them to change. And then I'm going to move all that down. This bottom piece here has to have a framing element at the bottom. Now I'm going to show this as a structural element so that it's easily seen. Let's copy this board here down in this corner, and then we'll rotate this from this corner. That's a minus 90-degree rotation. And that one will have an X drawn through it just to show that it's cut and it is framing. And that's where I want this whole piece to be. So now I'm going to move everything above, including that, down so this first board hits the top of the deck. Good. And then that I can bring back up to where it should be. There. That's how we're going to frame it into the deck. So these are just the joists. They can end up anywhere along this line. These are the deck pieces that finish off the topping. So I will move all this. And this is one of those videos that you're better off to watch first, see the big picture, and then move towards what you want to do with your particular project. Okay, so this is the actual floor joist. I'm going to copy that here because the framing sits on top of it. You can see what it's done here. It's actually cut into some of the decking. I won't be using these two pieces, and this piece will eventually just be cut in place. So I'm moving it perpendicular to the edge of the board. And that frames out my opening, how this is all going to sit in the opening. And you can see I got a fairly small lip here, and I got a fairly large lip there, but I'm not finished with this. Notice I'm only working on this side. Eventually I'll transfer it over. So what do we do in this space? This is grade. I'm going to put in a sheet of plywood and probably a 1/2 inch, depending on your application, 1/2, 5/8, maybe 3/4. 3/4 is a bit heavy. Will go down here. Let me show you how that works. So I'm going to put in a piece of plywood, and that plywood is going to be a 1/2 inch thick, and it's going to go down -4 feet. So at 0.5, -4 feet, there's my sheet of plywood. And the plywood is going to provide some support for the soil that's going to be leaning into this thing. But you'll notice where I have grade, there's a bit of an opening between that. This plywood, even though I buy pressure treated plywood, will eventually rot out if I don't protect it. And this is where we use pond liner to line the inside of this, and we wrap it around, and then we'll seal it with a tape and a sealer. It's EPDM is the name of the product from Aquascape that you could use. And I'm going to draw this here, but then I'm going to change its color. I'm using polyline, and the polyline will go here, and I will bring this straight down, and then I'm going to extend that just below soil level, about 6 inches, and you'll see why in a second. And this I'm going to make thicker. So I created a polyline, so I'll type in P-edit, and I'll select the rubber membrane and give it a width of 1/8 of an inch, 0.125, just so it's thicker. So what have I actually done here? Well, I'm creating an inside wall where the soil can then be built up to that location. What I do need is some backing or some framing support. So now I can use this information that I just left, for argument's sake, there. And it's basically providing the support on the plywood itself. And then we have this rubber membrane that's coming in through here. This is the detail I'm going to be drawing to make my planter. So I'm going to mirror that onto the other side. Let's see where it lands in all this. So I will mirror everything I've got here. And I'm going to mirror it between the middle of 2 points, 0.1, 0.2, straight down. So I'll switch to my F8, and that's where it's going to end up. So that rubber membrane runs all around the perimeter, and in fact here it should run underneath the top of this, but I haven't finished the top of the framing there. So I will copy this piece here and there. And this rubber framing, if I click on that, I'm going to add a vertex. And you can see what it's trying to do. I can then run that rubber framing or membrane underneath there and run it on top of there. Now, when I actually go to secure this top ledge, I'll going through the rubber membrane, but that's okay. It can leak at that point because the soil and the water won't be that high. So that's perfectly fine. So let's see, I'm going to do the same process here again, and it's just to remind you on some of the techniques we used earlier. This is modifying a polyline, so I'm going to add a vertex, and you'll see what it does. It adds it before that location. It all depends on the order in which you drew the polyline, but I can easily adjust those nodes. So now I've got a lined rubber inset in all this where I'm going to put in my framing. These two lines here actually extend all the way across because we'll see the back of the box. But the back of the box has the rubber membrane. We don't see it. So what happens here at grade? Well, a couple things. First of all, the grade doesn't run all the way through. This rubber membrane, if I'm drawing a section properly through this rubber membrane, I will add a vertex, goes right to that piece. So that's the back line of it. Now you may look at that and go, well, it now looks like it's a rubber basket. So what we're going to do instead of extending that line is I'm going to draw a line here. I'm going to change its properties so that it appears as a hidden line. I'm going to take these two lines, which are basically the grade, and change how they look inside of this. Let's first of all stretch. So let me get into the stretch command here. This grade line, both of them, just so you can see it going further beyond that edge. We don't see grade back here. I will trim to that and that, this. And that should indicate to the builder that something's going on in here. This is now hidden. Grade actually comes up into this area. Now you got to be careful as the soil gets loaded. What's going to happen is it may push out some of the sides. Sometimes we'll take this framing and extend it lower through the deck so it actually extends down. And that's an easy thing to do. You just take that framing and bring it all the way through and cap it at the bottom. It all depends on the size and the weight of this, but that's something the builder can do on site unless you want to make sure that it's built in a certain manner. Other times they may actually pack the grade up a bit, but we're near columns and we want to make sure we have 6 to 8 inches of concrete before we get to the actual beams that we have on either side. So this is just one technique. And yeah, it may blow out a bit, okay. But what we need to do now is indicate our soil levels in here. So I'm going to copy just one of these lines to an indicated soil level for now. And then I can decide how much soil, how high do I want this? Well, I may want to put in mulch in there as well. So let's say, for instance, I want 6 inches of mulch. And then I want that soil line to be slightly lower than that. So let's give it about 2 inches. So that's really where I'm going to have my line that represents the height of the soil. And then the mulch sits on top of that, like that. And I'm just using all one color for now, just because it's simpler to work with rather than switch back and forth, and I can change that at another time. So that's my mulch layer, and there is my soil layer. Let me just fix up the deck here a bit. I can identify the end of the actual decking material, so I will copy that line straight down. And what that is referencing is where my deck actually ends, because that's the end position of the deck. So I will extend to here, that, and that. And I have a 1/2 inch overhang, so I'll offset 0.5. Move that inwards. Trim that at this point. So the decking itself will go to that end. There we go. I will copy this. This will now be my rim board around the perimeter. And I will copy these deck boards. Probably 4 of them, not sure. And I will go right to perpendicular. Here we go. And then copy that. You can see I had to cut one of them, so I will copy that from there to there. And then I'll just take that and use the nodes here just to stretch that in place. So I still have ghosted out all the stuff that is with the deck except for post and beam information. Now, in this particular location, we don't have the footings. Those were for the pergola. So that layer, I'll make that current just for now. It doesn't matter. These are all just different items that you can see in the background to make sure that the builder knows what they're working with. So I'm going to leave it at that layer for now. That's fine. And I will draw a line because these are basic sonotubes. And all of this information, including the beam and saddle, that's taken care of somewhere else. It identifies those are the elements that are already there, and the builder is going to be putting them in, whereas this identifies clearly what the actual structure is going to be. I don't need this anymore. And that's a section through my planter. Now I'll add all my dimensions, my notations to what this all is, the 2x6 framing, the plywood sheathing, the rubberized membrane. This is basically pond liner. And that allows us to water the plants. And because it's an opening down to grade below, the water will filter eventually through and into the soil below. So what else do we have to worry about? Now, if you're putting in plants there that will be there all winter long, you may want to insulate these two walls here and here, just so that the soil in here doesn't abruptly freeze and therefore damage the root system of the plants. So we could add insulation to this and everything else, but that's a section through your planter. That's what it looks like through there. We'll do a series of drawings where I'll show a basic section of the planter, lay out the top view, put all my reference bubbles, and we're ready to finish off with our planter details. So after some consideration, here's my final example of what I've put together. I determined that it was very important that I show the framing and the base plate and how it will be attached to this, as well as this perimeter header, which I mentioned in my notes here. So here I also identify the opening sizes, which is critical for the builder to lay that out. You'll notice the opening sizes in here are slightly different because there's an overhang between the opening and the actual lip of the top of this double top rail planter. So those dimensions should make sense. And then the section I figured I would make at a larger scale, 1-inch scale, so then I can get lots of details and notes into one drawing without having multiple drawings here. So it's fairly simple and straightforward. I've also indicated in here the 4-foot sheet of plywood as a separate piece or a separate dimension because all the other ones more or less give all the details that are required. A lot of this is existing. We can't really change or modify, but the 4-foot sheet of plywood is a critical dimension because you're trying to identify, don't cut the plywood, make sure that you got the 4-foot lengths. Everything else is sort of either there already or has very little adjustment to it. So then I've identified here, you can see clearly how grade comes up into the planter, how the rubber membrane comes down into the soil, and then how there will be some sort of mix based on the type of plants that are to be put in this location. So that's all up for still discussion, deliberation, and therefore I haven't included it in here. I didn't want to put in some sort of mulch hatch at this point, just because it may vary to what kind of mulch, and it becomes distracting to all the information that I have in here. So there's my final project, simple, straightforward, easy to build from, and it is completed now and ready for notations on L1 to match everything that I have here.